Hi there everyone, this is a video for the 3.02 lesson, Depression. Everyday life in the 1930s was extremely difficult. From the Dust Bowl of the Great Plains to the bread lines on Wall Street, Americans suffered grave hardships. Some of these were captured in music, some in literature. From John Steinbeck to Woody Guthrie, artists had trouble communicating the feeling that this land was made for you and me. Goals for this lesson: recognize the causes of the Dust Bowl and its effects on plains farming, describe the western migration of plains farmers, and give examples of the effects of the Great Depression on Americans' lives. Okay, so go to lesson resources. Do not forget to grab your reading guide and or your lesson answer key, and you'll see there's also a drought worksheet, and save that to go through a little bit later. Daily checklist, read pages 679 through 682. Complete the reading guide, complete the Brother Can You Spare a Dime activity, which will lead us to the graded assignment. And then there's a virtual field trip, Drought in the 1930s, where you will use that drought sheet. So let's begin with the reading for today, starting on page 679. Okay, starting with the human toll of the Great Depression. Let's look at the pictures first. The one here at the top right. During the Depression, many families lost their homes. Here, an evicted couple in Los Angeles sits by their belongings. So they were evicted from their house because they couldn't pay either their rent or their house payments, and everything they owned was out there on the street. And then this bottom left picture, multitudes of homeless people congregated in makeshift shanty towns like this one, known as Hoovervilles. And they were calling them Hoovervilles after the first president of the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover, who they felt was not doing enough to help with the problems of the Great Depression. Okay, let's get Pickles untangled from the cord, and let's begin reading. The collapse of the nation's economy took a terrible toll in human suffering. Millions of Americans were destitute. Many American families lost their homes. More than 1 million men wandered around the country trying to find jobs. Tens of thousands of homeless people gathered in makeshift shanty towns known as Hoovervilles, named for the president who seemed powerless to stop for the economic freefall. In Chicago, 50 men, women, and children fought to get at a barrel of garbage outside a restaurant. Across the nation, families ate nothing but whatever scraps of food and stale bread they could find. Men sold apples or needles and thread on street corners. America had never before experienced such severe, hard times. At the outset of the Depression, there was no government safety net of the kind that exists today. No unemployment insurance for people who lost their jobs, no food stamps, no access to health care for the destitute, no welfare programs to help children and their parents. Unions had little power to help workers. State and local governments and charities tried to help as much as they could. New York City paid jobless people $2.39 a week, all it could afford. Detroit tried to raise money for people who had lost their jobs in the auto industry, but the city could not tax the big car companies because they lay beyond the city limits. People lined up for meals from charity soup kitchens that barely provided them enough sustenance to stay alive. In 1932, officials of New York City schools reported that 20,000 children were malnourished. Families suffered in many ways. Between 1929 and 1933, the marriage rate fell by 22%, and the number of children born dropped 15%. Young people were unwilling or unable to start families in such trying economic circumstances. For men who could no longer provide for their wives and children, the Depression was especially discouraging. An unemployed man told an interviewer, "Before the Depression, I wore the pants in this family, and rightly so. During the Depression, I lost something. Maybe you call it self-respect, but in losing it, I also lost the respect of my children, and I'm afraid I'm losing my wife." The Dust Bowl. In the southern Great Plains states, the Depression combined with a natural disaster, partly created by human activity, to produce an equally grim kind of suffering. Farming on the Great Plains, once nearly impossible, had increased dramatically after 1900. New farm machines such as combines and mechanized tractors allowed farmers to break through hard soil. During the boom years of the mid-1920s, across the middle of the country, Americans converted millions of acres of grassland into vast fields of cotton or wheat. The onset of the Depression left people across the nation too poor to buy the crops. By 1931, the oversupply of wheat forced down the price by almost two-thirds, leaving many farmers unable to pay the cost of producing their crop. Moreover, in the course of converting the land to wheat and cotton production, farmers had ripped off the protective tall grasses and thin topsoil of the Great Plains. With the onset of a drought that continued through most of the 1930s, the land became a desert. Constant winds whipped the dry earth into blinding storms of dust, so much dust that it settled as far away as Boston and New York. The storms made the skies over the plains pitch dark even at high noon, and killed the few crops that had stubbornly remained. The environmental disaster gave the region its name, the Dust Bowl. And if we look here at the picture on the map, it's showing the location. The orange is the most severe area. What you see is the corner of Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, Oklahoma. And then it also shows the extent of the wind erosion. In the yellow, that's from top to bottom, where it all extended. And all the lines showing the areas affected in different years. And this picture at the bottom right, farming practices and drought worsened that already dire economic and environmental disaster that was the Dust Bowl. So it's just a windstorm going on here. You see them trying to get back to their small shack to get out of the dust and the wind. Thousands of farmers were ruined, unable to grow anything on land they had borrowed money to buy. People in the small towns of the region were ruined as well, as farm-related businesses and banks closed. Desperate individuals and families left the region, taking with them only what they could pack in a car or truck. Some followed relatives who had moved west years earlier. Many set out with no certain prospects, chasing mere rumors of work. Hundreds of thousands of people headed for California along Route 66. They fled from ruined lands in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado. While some 20% were indeed from Oklahoma, people began to refer to all of the migrants as Okies. Some migrants from the towns and cities of the Dust Bowl found work in the cities of California. Some formed communities called Little Oklahomas. Wherever they settled in California, they brought their southwestern ways, their evangelical Protestantism, and their love of country music. Those looking for farm work were not so fortunate. Most of the rumors of jobs in the fields of the San Joaquin Valley or other agricultural centers of California prove false. Thousands of destitute and hungry men, women, and children found themselves stuck in filthy roadside refugee camps. Unable to provide for such an enormous influx of poor people, California and other states looked for ways to keep the migrants out. California sent Border Patrol guards to push the migrants back into Arizona, but the Okies kept coming. In 1933, California lawmakers passed the Indigent Act, which made it a crime for anyone to bring a needy non-resident of California into the state. When people were arrested for bringing their poor relatives from Oklahoma and other Dust Bowl states, the law was challenged in court. The American Civil Liberties Union brought suit against the state of California, and eventually the case made it to the Supreme Court. In 1941, the court found the California's Indigent Act unconstitutional and ruled that no state could limit the movement of any American from one state to the other. And then I want to read this little excerpt here at the top about Woody Guthrie. Born in 1912, the son of a cowboy, Woody Guthrie was one of the Okies who left the prairies during the storms of the Dust Bowl. He went on to become America's best-known folk singer. When the oil town he grew up in went bust, Guthrie, still a teenager, moved to Texas. From there, like thousands of other Okies, he walked, hitchhiked, and rode freight trains to California. In return for food and a place to sleep, he sang and played guitar. After he arrived in California, Guthrie became famous for songs that drew on his experience, like titles like Talking Dust Bowl Blues and Blowing Down That Old Dusty Road. He took up political protest and radical activism, always urging his country to do more for the common man. He also wrote a deeply patriotic song known and loved by many Americans today, This Land is Your Land. And I will sing a little bit of it, even though it might be painful. It goes like this, and maybe it'll be familiar to you. This land is your land, this my land is my land, from California to the New York Island. And I'll stop there, but perhaps that tune is familiar to you after I sing a bit of it. Let's continue on with the reading. Congress takes action. Hoover had always been an idealist who felt that people could sensibly cooperate to make good things happen. But as factories laid off workers or shut down completely, as farmers lost everything, and as banks began to fail by the hundreds, Hoover began pushing for stronger government action to fight the Depression. In late 1931, Hoover proposed forming a chain of federal home loan banks that would lend money to support mortgages, the loans with which people bought homes. bought homes. For millions of people having trouble meeting their mortgage payments, the measure promised to help them keep their homes. Congress made the bill less generous than the president had hoped, and it did not pass until July 1932. By then, tens of thousands more Americans had gone bankrupt and lost their homes. At Hoover's urging in January 1932, Congress created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, RFC, an unprecedented entry by the government into the world of business. The RFC's purpose was to enable the government to lend money directly to banks in order to keep them in business and empower them to resume making loans of their own. An economist at Columbia University remarked that Mr. Hoover is now in the process of pushing the government into the banking business. The RFC also made loans to the railroads and other businesses. Critics complained that the RFC's loans went mostly to big businesses. While the RFC did not turn back the Depression, it at least helped prevent a complete collapse of the banking system. In July 1932, Hoover signed the Relief and Reconstruction Act, which allowed the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to spend up to $1.5 billion on public work projects, such as building highways and parks, in an attempt to create jobs that would put people back to work. The act also provided $300 million to the states so they could make relief payments to their residents. Still, state and local governments could not meet the ever-increasing demands for aid. Most states were and are constitutionally bound to operate under a balanced budget, which means they cannot spend more money they take in. But as more and more individuals and businesses went bankrupt, the need for state and increased even as states lost tax revenues. Private charities such as the Salvation Army found their resources strained because fewer people had money to donate. In July 1932, Hoover vetoed a bill that would have authorized relief payments by the federal government. He still feared that letting people become directly dependent on federal aid, even temporarily, would set a dangerous precedent. Another piece of legislation, the 1932 Revenue Act, did more harm than good. Consistent with the economic thinking of his time, Hoover was determined to balance the federal budget. To do this, the government needed to bring in money. The Revenue Act instituted the biggest peacetime tax increases in American history. Even though most of the tax burden was placed on the people with higher incomes, the act proved a mistake. Its main effect was to further stall the already crippled national economy. Okay, let's just go back a little bit here to the excerpt about John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath. And I'm just going to read the introduction. I'm not going to read the excerpt, but here's the introduction. The Grapes of Wrath is one of the keystone pieces of literature that was produced about the Great Depression. John Steinbeck's celebrated novel, The Grapes of Wrath, tells the story of the Joad family, who, like thousands of other families displaced by the Dust Bowl, made the long journey along Route 66 from their wasted farms to California's fertile Central Valley. A few years before writing the novel, Steinbeck had been sent by the San Francisco News to write a series of articles on the migrant camps. He was so overwhelmed by what he saw that he resolved to write a big book about the hardships and determination of the migrants. When The Grapes of Wrath was published in 1939, it became an immediate and controversial bestseller. Steinbeck was attacked as a communist, and the novel was banned in many communities. Steinbeck wrote, The vilification of me from the large landowners and bankers is pretty bad. The latest is a rumor started by them that the Okies hate me and have threatened to kill me for lying about them. The Grapes of Wrath was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1940. In 1962, Steinbeck won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And then the excerpt is just a part from the book itself. And I'm not going to read through that. You can certainly read through that on your own. I would encourage you to do that. And here, the Song for Hard Times. And this is what we're going to be doing the assignment on. And I'm not going to get into it too much right now because we're going to work on that for the 3.02 assignment. But there's also the lyrics here. We'll also see them in the activity that we complete. And I think I went a page too far. Let me go back. Hoover's Decline. Actually, I'm going to stop here, start the next video with Hoover's Decline, and we'll begin there. Thank you very much for listening to part 1 of lesson 3.02.